They mocked him for his silence. A homeless man in a corner booth, jacket frayed, boots by the door. To the bikers, he was just another drifter to laugh at, to humiliate in front of a crowd. But when a leather case slipped from his pack and a glint of gold caught the light, the room discovered the truth. He wasn't broken. He wasn't weak. He was Sergeant Daniel Hayes, Medal of Honor, Afghanistan, carrying names and sacrifices no one could ever repay. And by nightfall, everyone who witnessed it would never forget. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The rain came steady that morning, the kind that blurred the edges of a small Vermont town until everything looked washed in gray. Cars hissed as they passed along the slick road, and the neon sign of the diner flickered faintly against the wet pavement. Inside, the air carried the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee, a comfort for regulars who had come to know its warmth as a shield from the weather outside. The door opened with tired creak, and a figure stepped in, broad-shouldered, hunched slightly as if the weight of years clung to him more than the damp jacket on his back. His boots, once built for endurance, sagged and cracked at the seams. Mud clung to their sides, and rust had stained the lace eyelets into an uneven red-brown. He paused, not rushing forward like a man desperate for food or heat, but taking a moment as though asking the room for permission to enter. Then, in a small act of courtesy that seemed almost ceremonial, he slid the boots from his feet and left them neatly by the door. No one asked him to do it. No sign demanded it. Yet he placed them there with deliberate care, setting them side by side as though they were still worthy of respect. His socks were thin, darkened from long wear, and the floor beneath him was cold, but he walked barefoot to the farthest booth without complaint. His movements were measured, quiet, like someone used to folding himself into spaces where no one wanted him to be noticed. Heads turned briefly from steaming plates and morning newspapers. Some eyes held curiosity, others impatience, and a few looked quickly away, unwilling to acknowledge what his presence stirred in them. The man lowered himself onto the vinyl seat with a weary patience, his frame still strong despite the years etched across his face. His jacket, patched and frayed at the cuffs, carried the smell of rain-soaked canvas. He folded it neatly beside him, smoothing the edges as though the act of order brought dignity to fabric long past its prime. Then he folded his hands on the table and waited. He didn't wave for service or speak up. He simply sat with a quietness that seemed almost foreign in a place filled with clinking forks and the buzz of conversation. Maria, the waitress who had worked the morning shift for more years than most of the regulars could remember, noticed him without hesitation. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't hand him a menu. She simply walked over, poured a steaming cup of coffee into a chipped mug, and slid it in front of him. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, and she gave him a small smile before moving on. To anyone else it looked like routine, but the exchange carried the weight of familiarity. He had been there before, and she had always treated him the same. A few boots away, two men whispered over their plates, their voices low, but not so low that the sound failed to reach others. Words like drifter and charity case slipped through the air. Another patron shook his head in quiet disapproval, but kept his eyes on his eggs, unwilling to invite conflict. The man in the corner didn't respond. He lifted the mug carefully, blowing across the surface before taking a slow sip. His hands were rough, scarred from work or war, yet steady as they held the cup. The rain outside tapped against the windows, blending with the low hum of a diner radio, playing songs decades old. Time seemed slower in that moment, stretched in between the warmth of the room and the chill carried in with the man's silence. His presence unsettled some, comforted others, but he asked for nothing beyond that coffee. The boots by the door remained where he had placed them. Two battered sentinels, standing guard at the edge of a space that didn't quite know what to make of him. In the corner booth, he sat still as stone, a figure at once invisible and impossible to ignore, waiting for the day to unfold in whatever way it would. The farthest booth in the diner had always been the quietest, tucked against the window where the glass rattled faintly in its frame whenever a truck rumbled past on the wet road. It was there the man settled, lowering himself with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy in every gesture. His head remained bowed, chin nearly touching his chest, as though he hoped the posture itself might render him invisible. The jacket he wore bore the years plainly. Fabric worn thin along the shoulders, frayed threads curling from the cuffs, and seams patched clumsily with mismatched cloth. Rain had darkened the sleeves uneven shades, and his hair, damp and matted, clung against his temples. Around him, the morning crowd carried on with the small rituals of routine. A retired couple shared a crossword puzzle, trading pens back and forth without looking up. A delivery driver hunched over his eggs, scrolling through his phone with grease-stained fingers. Teenagers on their way to school clutched paper cups of cocoa, laughing louder than necessary, their eyes sliding past a man without recognition. He sat apart from them all, the space around him a kind of boundary no one crossed, not out of respect but discomfort. To most, he wasn't a guest but a shadow, part of the scenery they would rather ignore. He placed his hands flat on the table, scarred knuckles pressing against the formica surface. Beneath his nails lingered the gray of dirt and asphalt, impossible to scrub away with water from gas station restrooms. He didn't fidget or shift in his seat. He simply remained still, staring at nothing in particular, his eyes downcast. Every so often he reached for the coffee Maria had brought, lifting it slowly, taking a sip, and then setting it back down with precision that made even that simple act seem deliberate. Outside, the rain blurred the passing cars, headlights streaking across the window in pale streaks of light. The glass caught his faint reflection, but he didn't look at it. His focus remained inward, locked somewhere far from the hum of the diner. A truck horn sounded in the distance, and for a moment his shoulders tensed, then released, as though even now, years removed from battles most had forgotten, certain sounds carried weight he couldn't set down. From the counter, a man in a baseball cap glanced over, his mouth tightening into a thin line. He muttered something to the woman beside him about how the place had started to let in anyone. The woman gave a small shrug, but didn't look. Across the room, Maria refilled coffee cups, her expression giving away nothing, though her eyes flicked now and then toward the corner booth. She had seen him many mornings before, always quiet, always alone, and always leaving without incident. The man's jacket shifted slightly as he leaned back, revealing a glimpse of the worn canvas pack beside him on the seat. Its straps were frayed nearly to breaking, and its fabric bore stains of travel and weather. A corner of something leather peeked from the half-zipped pouch, but he adjusted it quickly, concealing whatever it was. His movements were neither hurried nor fearful, only protective, like a man guarding what Louis still called his own. No one asked his name. No one wondered aloud where he came from or where he went after mornings like this. To most, he was simply part of the town's unnoticed landscape, as ordinary and unremarkable as the rain tapping on the window. He preferred it that way, drawing no attention, offering no conversation, carrying his silence like a shield. The far booth gave him space, and in that space he became both present and absent, there in body, gone in the eyes of nearly everyone else. And so he remained, a solitary figure in a crowded room, fading into the background even as the details of his presence pressed themselves quietly into the memory of the place. Maria moved to the diner the way only someone who had worked there for decades could, swift, practiced, and without wasted motion. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every stubborn hinge on the swinging kitchen door, every regular's preference down to the sugar-to-cream ratio. Her hair, once dark, was now threaded with silver, pulled back neatly into a bun that had survived countless double shifts. She carried herself with a kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be announced. When she noticed a man in the corner, she didn't hesitate, didn't pause to ask if he wanted anything. She simply reached for one of the chipped white mugs stacked by the coffee pot and filled it to the brim with steaming black coffee. Her shoes squeaked softly on the linoleum as she crossed the room, weaving between tables where conversations carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. She placed the mug in front of him gently, the small smile on her face both familiar and unspoken. She never asked him for payment right away. She never asked him for words he rarely gave. Instead, she treated him as though his presence was as normal as any other customer's, a subtle courtesy in a world that had largely forgotten to offer him any. The man lifted his head just enough to meet her eyes for a brief moment. His expression didn't change, but he gave the faintest nod. Maria understood. She had come to recognize that his gratitude lived in gestures rather than words. He wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat soak into his palms, and inhaled the bitter scent. To him, that coffee wasn't just a drink. It was warmth, acknowledgement, and a reminder that for at least a little while, he could sit in peace without being told to move along. The chipped mug wasn't chosen by accident. Maria kept a small set of them aside, mugs that bore cracks in the glaze or worn edges that didn't quite match the rest. They were the ones no one else wanted, the ones customers sometimes complained about, but to her they belonged to him. It was as though the mug mirrored his own condition, weathered, imperfect, yet still capable of holding something valuable. She placed it before him every time he came in, and every time he accepted it without a word. The rest of the diner paid little attention, though a few regulars glanced at the corner with sidelong looks. Some whispered about him being a drifter, a burden, someone who would never order more than that one coffee. Maria heard the whispers but didn't engage. She had long ago stopped caring what people thought of her choices. Her kindness wasn't for their approval, and she wasn't about to let the small town's gossip dictate who deserved a seat in her diner. Steam rose from the mug, curling upward before vanishing into the air. The man took a careful sip, holding the cup steady with both hands. His shoulders relaxed slightly, the rigid tension easing as the warmth traveled through him. Maria lingered for a moment, watching quietly to make sure he had what he needed. Then she moved on, refilling another cup, scribbling down an order, calling back to the cook. But every few minutes, her eyes drifted back to the corner booth, not in pity, not in suspicion, but in the way one checks on a guest who matters more than he lets on. For the man, that single act, coffee pour out asking, meant more than any words of welcome could. It told him he wasn't invisible to everyone, that someone saw him without demanding he prove his worth. In the small ritual between waitress and veteran, unspoken but constant, there was a fragile thread of dignity holding fast in a world that had done its best to strip it away. And so he sat there, head bent, jacket frayed, drinking from a chipped mug that carried more comfort than anyone else in the room would ever understand. The diner had its own rhythm, steady as the rain against the windows. Forks scraped plates, knives cut through pancakes slick with syrup, and a hum of casual talk rose and fell like background music. Yet beneath that comfort was a current of unease, directed toward the corner booth where the man sat with his chipped mug in silence. Conversations that had once been about the weather or last night's game turned, almost without effort, into whispers that carried his name without ever being spoken. At the counter, two farmers leaned close over their bacon and eggs, their voices kept low, but not so low that others couldn't hear. "Another drifter," one muttered, pushing his plate aside with a look that mixed annoyance and suspicion. The other gave a quick nod, chewing slowly before replying, "Always trouble, that kind. Sit around, drink a coffee they can't pay for, then move on before you know what hit you." Their words were spoken as if he were deaf or too far gone to notice, though the corner booth wasn't more than a dozen steps away. A man in a baseball cap turned on a stool, eyeing the veteran over his shoulder. "Betty's sleeping behind the gas station again," he said, not bothering to whisper. The waitress passing by shot him a look, one sharp enough to cut the air, but he only shrugged and went back to his plate. At a nearby booth, two women tried to keep their voices light, disguising judgment with humor. "Imagine the smell of that jacket." One laughed softly. "Rain can't wash years off a man like that." Her friend giggled, covering her mouth, though her eyes flicked quickly toward a veteran with a trace of guilt. The man in the corner never responded. He kept his head down, sipping his coffee in deliberate silence. The whispers brushed past him like wind through trees. He heard them, certainly, but gave no sign that they mattered. His stillness seemed to unsettle some more than his presence itself, as though they expected him to defend himself, to rise to anger, to prove the very suspicion they whispered. Instead, he gave them nothing. The cook, visible through the open past window, muttered under his breath as he plated another omelet. He had seen the man before, knew the routine, but made no move to intervene. To him, the whispers were part of the ritual, as predictable as a morning coffee rush. Still, his eyes lingered now and then on the corner booth, the way one might glance at a storm cloud hovering on the horizon. At another table, an older woman stirred her tea without drinking, her gaze fixed on the man as though trying to place him. There was something about his posture, the way he held himself even in exhaustion, that tugged at her memory. But she said nothing, unwilling to speak against the tide of muttering voices around her. Maria heard it all. She didn't need to strain to catch the words. She had learned long ago that judgment rarely cared about discretion. She refilled mugs, set down plates, and moved with the same steady rhythm, but each whispered word reached her ears. She carried them silently, the way she carried empty plates back to the kitchen, refusing to let them spill onto the man who sat in her corner booth. The whispers gathered like a storm cloud above him, thickening the air of the diner. They weren't shouted, weren't cruel in volume, but their persistence carved at the edges of the man's presence. Still, he remained unshaken, anchored in his corner, hands steady on his mug. To most, he was no more than a drifter. To Maria, he was a man who deserved his seat and his coffee, whether the others chose to see it or not. And in that quiet defiance, she continued to serve, letting the whispers roll past her like the rain against the glass, knowing storms always break eventually. The sound reached the diner before the men themselves did, a low rumble that grew steadily louder until it seemed to press against the walls. The clatter of forks and the buzz of small-town talk faltered as everyone inside turned their heads toward the rain-slicked windows. Through the gray blur of water streaking the glass, headlights cut across the parking lot. Their beams fractured into streaks of light. Then came the roar, motorcycles, half a dozen at least, pulling in hard, tires splashing arcs of water as they skidded into place. The engines idled heavy, throaty, and deliberate, as if meant to announce their arrival to more than just the people inside. Rain hammered leather and chrome alike, sliding off the wide handlebars and dripping from black boots planted firmly on the ground. The riders swung their legs over and dismounted, their jackets creaking as water streamed down in rivulets. Patches stitched across the backs glistened with rain, bold insignias made sharper by the sheen of wetness. They carried themselves like men accustomed to owning whatever space they entered, laughter rising loud enough to pierce through the closed diner doors. The bell above the entrance gave a feeble ring as the door swung open, admitting a rush of damp air and the sharp scent of gasoline and wet asphalt. Their boots struck the floor in heavy rhythm, one after the other, until the room seemed to shrink around them. Conversations that had carried on moments earlier stopped altogether. The farmers at the counter lowered their eyes. The teenagers fell silent, and even the cook paused in the act of sliding a plate onto the past shelf. Only the rain remained constant, drumming against the windows as though to mark time. The bikers filled the doorway with their presence, broad shoulders and dripping leather, making them seem larger than life. Their voices rose over one another, deep laughs echoing against the diner's tiled walls. One slapped another on the back, the sound sharp and careless, while a third shook his head like a dog, sending droplets across the floor without concern for where they landed. They spread out slowly, scanning the room not for empty seats, but for reactions. The power of their entrance lay not in their number, but in the way they demanded acknowledgement without asking. Maria stepped forward with practiced calm, her apron already damp from the morning rush, and asked how many seats they needed. They ignored her for a beat, surveying the booths and counter, smirking at the discomfort they caused. Finally, one of them barked a number, and they slid into a cluster of booths near the center, their wet jackets squeaking against the vinyl. Their laughter rolled on, coarse and unrestrained, punctuated by the thud of fists on tabletops and the scrape of chairs dragged across the floor. From the corner, the veteran didn't lift his head. He sat exactly as he had before, mug in hand, jacket folded at his side, as though their entrance hadn't changed the air around him. The rain had softened now, but the sound of their engine still echoed faintly in the parking lot, a reminder that their presence was temporary only in the sense that they chose when it would end. Eyes shifted back and forth between the gang and the man in the corner, though no one yet knew that the paths of the two were set to collide. For the moment, the diner lived in that uneasy balance, the warmth of eggs cooling on plates, the hiss of rain outside, and the laughter of men who brought the storm in with them, dripping leather and all. The door swung wide, banging harder against the wall than it needed to, and the bell above it gave a frantic jingle as though warning the room. The men filed in without pause, boots striking the linoleum with the heavy rhythm of people who knew they were being watched. Water dripped from their jackets in dark streams, pooling near the entrance before being tracked farther inside. Their voices rose instantly, filling the diner with laughter and sharp bursts of talk. Each word carried louder than necessary, meant to claim the air the way their motorcycles had claimed the lot outside. They didn't take time to notice the smell of bacon or the warmth of coffee. They noticed instead the way the room quieted, heads bent toward plates, conversations cut off mid-sentence, and eyes darted back down quickly after being caught looking too long. It was a silence they fed on, the way people shrank back into themselves as the bikers pushed farther into the room. One swung his arm casually as he moved, brushing a salt shaker from a table edge just to hear it rattle across the floor. Another leaned over the counter as though it belonged to him, tapping a spoon against a plate with deliberate noise before sliding onto a stool. The farmers at the counter shifted uneasily, their forks paused in midair, and the teenagers in the corner booth went still, wide-eyed but trying not to show it. The bikers noticed all of it, every flicker of discomfort, and they grinned at one another with the satisfaction of men who thrived on being a disruption. One of them smacked his hand on the back of a chair, laughing loud enough to make the cook flinch behind the past window. The sound rolled through the room, out of proportion with the small space, leaving echoes that seemed to linger even after the laughter faded. Maria approached with a calm that had taken years to learn, pad in hand, voice steady. She asked what they wanted, as though they were no different than the regulars she served every day. They gave their orders in pieces, drawn out with mocking tones, one pretending to deliberate too long, another tossing in demand for extra bacon with a smirk meant to test her patience. They paid little attention to the menu, more to the way their words carried, bouncing off the walls of the diner and drawing everyone else further into their orbit. Once they slid into their seats, they spread themselves out, arms draped over chair backs, legs stretched wide. The booth seemed smaller with them inside, the space overwhelmed by their presence. Jackets squeaked against the vinyl, wet leather press flat as they leaned in to talk across tables, their voices competing rather than blending, each man trying to outdo the others in volume. Every burst of laughter was like a hammer striking, breaking through the low hum of the radio that tried and failed to fill the background. In the corner, the veteran remained still. His coffee sat between his hands, steam rising slowly, his gaze fixed on the table. He hadn't moved when they entered, hadn't flinched at the sudden crash of the door or the sound of their boots. If he noticed the way they filled the diner, he gave no sign. To them, he was invisible for the moment, a shadow pressing to the farthest booth. But the room itself seemed to bend toward what was coming. Every whisper of discomfort, every too loud laugh tightened the air until it felt ready to break. The bikers had arrived, and in the simple act of being louder, heavier, more present than anyone else, they had taken the diner for themselves. The others adjusted around them, shrinking, accommodating, trying not to provoke. The veteran alone did not shift, his silence a steady line drawn against the noise. The noise rolled on, uneven and sharp, as the bikers settled into their new territory. Their voices overlapped, each one determined to be the loudest, their laughter pitched high enough to make sure no one could forget they were there. But amid the clatter of words and the scrape of boots against tile, one of them let his gaze wander. He leaned back in his seat, stretching his arm across the top of the booth, and his eyes slid toward the far corner of the diner. That's when he saw him. The man sitting alone, hunched low over his chipped mug, jacket frayed, hair damp from a rain. The biker's grin changed shape, from casual amusement to something sharper. He gave a small elbow to the man beside him, jerking his chin toward the corner. The second looked over, squinting through the haze of steam rising from the plates just arriving from the kitchen. Recognition wasn't needed. All it took was the sight of a figure sitting apart, silent, carrying himself differently from the rest. A smirk curved across his face, then another as the wordless message traveled down the row of men. Their laughter faltered briefly, then picked up again, but this time it carried an edge. The veteran did not lift his eyes. He sat as he always had, posture careful, hands steady around his cup. The chipped mug was warm against his skin, a small anchor in a room that had shifted with the roar of engines and the heavy steps of men who wanted to be seen. He had known, perhaps from the moment they entered, that sooner or later someone would look his way. He didn't change. His silence held. At the counter, Maria felt it before it fully began. She noticed the way the first biker tilted his head, the glance that lasted too long, the smirks beginning to ripple like cracks in glass. She tightened her grip on the coffee pot she carried, her jaw set as she refilled a customer's cup without missing a beat. She had watched men like this before, different faces, same look in her eyes when they singled someone out. Trouble always started with a glance that turned into a smile that wasn't kind but predatory. The farmers at the counter glanced back once, then quickly lowered their heads, their forks moving faster, as if finishing breakfast sooner might excuse them from what was coming. The teenagers whispered nervously, their words too soft to carry, but their expressions plain. The cook, hidden partly by the past window, muttered something inaudible, the clang of a spatula against the grill louder than it needed to be. The bikers didn't rush it. They let the awareness hang in the room, savoring the way their attention shifted everyone else's mood. A few leaned forward, resting their elbows on the table, eyes locked on a man in the corner booth as if sizing him up. The leader, broad-shouldered and heavy with tattoos that ran down his neck, drummed his fingers against the table in slow rhythm. The sound steady, deliberate. His grin never faded. Still, the veteran gave nothing. No glance, no change in posture, no reaction that would tell them they had been noticed in return. His silence wasn't empty. It was full, layered, the kind that made more noise by not speaking than their voices did by shouting. The chipped mug rose to his lips, lowered again, steam fading into the air, and his gaze stayed fixed downward. The smirk spread wider. One of them let out a sharp laugh. Not at any joke told at the table, but at the sight of the man ignoring them. It was a kind of laugh meant to provoke, to say without words that invisibility wasn't an option anymore. The corner booth was no longer just a seat by the window. It had become a target. The air in the diner shifted, subtle but undeniable. The customers knew it. Maria knew it. Even the cook with his head bent over the grill knew it. Trouble had chosen its mark, and the man with the worn boots by the door was about to be pulled from his silence, whether he wanted it or not. The first remark came softly, disguised as a joke between friends, but the words carried easily in the quiet that had fallen over the diner. One of the bikers leaned back in his seat, voice pitched just high enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like the corner booth's got a new mascot," he said, smirking as his companions laughed louder than the comment deserved. Another chimed in, his tone sharper. "Bet he hasn't paid for a meal in years. Just sits there, soaking up free heat and coffee." The laughter that followed rang hollow. The kind meant less for humor than for intimidation. The veteran did not move. His eyes stayed lowered, fixed on the steam curling up from his mug. His hand didn't even tremble as he lifted it and took another slow sip. The stillness unsettled them more than outrage would have. They wanted a flinch, a glance, any sign that their words had struck. Instead, they got silence, and the silence became its own quiet defiance. "Hey, old man," another called out across the room, resting his elbows wide on the table so his voice carried further. "Nice jacket. Where'd you dig that up? Lost and found the dump?" The group roared, clapping the table, their laughter filling the space like smoke. One of them gave a mock salute, hand sloppy against his forehead, the motion dripping with mockery. "Sir, yes, sir," he barked, before snickering into his drink. The cook banged a pan louder than necessary against the grill, his jaw tight, but he kept his eyes on the food. The farmers at the counter shifted uneasily, one muttering under his breath, "Leave alone," though not loud enough to be heard. Maria moved through the diner with her pot of coffee, her lips pressed thin, her eyes hard. She stopped at a table to pour, but her attention stayed fixed on the corner, watching the man, watching them. She knew the rhythm of bullying, the way it started small and tested the air before rising higher. The bikers were throwing out their hooks, and his refusal to bite only seemed to provoke them more. One of them leaned out of his booth, craning his neck toward the veteran. "What's the matter? Don't talk much. Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you left it in the gutter where you sleep." His grin widened as his companions cackled, pounding their fists against the table like children egging each other on. Their stares locked on him now, eyes narrow, their laughter edged with cruelty. The man in the corner sat straighter, but not in aggression. It was subtle, a shift of shoulders, a deeper breath. His silence didn't waver, though, and that was what stung the most. He wasn't giving them fear. He wasn't giving them anger. He was giving them nothing, and nothing made their voices grow sharper. "Hey, why don't you tell us a story?" Another called, voice mocking in its cheer. "Bet you got some real good ones. Bet none of them end with a roof over your head." The laughter hit again, bouncing around the small room, echoing against tile and chrome. The veteran placed his mug down gently, not looking up, not acknowledging, but in that careful gesture there was strength. It was the patience of a man who had heard worse, seen worse, lived worse. Cold stares lingered on him like knives pressed to his skin, waiting for the smallest movement to cut. But he didn't give them the satisfaction. He sat in his corner booth, jacket worn, hair damp, a figure of silence against their noise, while the rest of the diner held its breath, knowing something heavier was coming. The tension had thickened like smoke, invisible but felt in every corner of the diner. The bikers had run through their jokes and mock salutes, their voices rising louder as if daring anyone to challenge them. Customers sat stiffly at their tables, pretending to focus on plates that had long since cooled, their eyes flicking nervously toward the corner booth where the veteran still sat, unflinching. Maria carried herself carefully, balancing trays, her face set in practiced calm. She knew how to walk through storms like this, but even she sensed the balance tilting towards something that couldn't be undone. She emerged from the kitchen with a plate stacked high, steam rolling off eggs, bacon, and toast glistening with butter. She steadied the tray with her hand as she moved between tables, keeping her steps measured. One of the bikers, broad-shouldered and grinning wide, noticed her passing. He shifted just enough, swinging his arm carelessly into her path. The tray jolted, the plate slid, and before Maria could catch it, the food spilled downward, landing across the shoulder of the man in the corner booth. The sizzle of bacon hitting fabric seemed louder than it should have been. Grease smeared across the veteran's jacket, staining the warm material with fresh blotches. Egg yolk ran in slow trails down the sleeve, dripping onto the seat. For a moment, the diner froze. Forks stopped midair. Conversations cut off. Even the rain outside seemed to hush against the glass. The biker leaned back in his booth, spreading his arms wide as if to declare innocence. "Oops," he said with mock sweetness, his voice carrying far too easily across the room. Laughter broke out among his companions, rough and unrestrained, each man pounding the table or slapping his thigh as though the moment were the best joke of the morning. Maria gasped softly, setting the tray quickly on the counter before reaching for a rag. Her eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her tone steady. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice directed at the veteran, though everyone knew the accident hadn't been hers. She began blotting at his jacket, but he gently moved her hand aside, his own lifting to wipe the sleeve with deliberate care. His expression didn't change. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't even glare at the men laughing only a few feet away. He simply cleaned the mess in silence, folding the napkin over the stains until the worst of it was contained. The biker who had caused it leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, smirked firmly in place. "Guess breakfast didn't agree with you," he said, his companions roaring once more. Another chimed in. "Might be the best meal he's had in months." The words carried weight sharp in the food itself, designed to cut deeper than grease and yolk could ever stain. The veteran folded the soiled napkin neatly and set it on the table. His movements were precise, calm, each one betraying no hint of anger. That composure unnerved some of the customers, who had expected him to explode, to lash back, to give the bikers a reaction they were working toward. Instead, his silence became heavier, more pointed, filling the space between laughter and shame. Maria stood beside him, her hands clenched around the rag, torn between fury and fear. She looked at the bikers, her jaw set, then back at the man she had served countless cups of coffee. He shook his head faintly, a gesture not of defeat but of restraint, as if telling her not to waste her breath on men who thrived on cruelty. The laughter eventually softened, giving way to smirks and whispered comments, but the damage lingered in the air. The veteran sat with grease on his jacket and yolk drying on his sleeve, his dignity intact even as the room's discomfort deepened. The bikers had tested him, had tried to break his silence with humiliation, but all they had done was reveal how much louder quiet strength could be than cruelty shouted across a diner. The diner seemed to hold its breath. The plate's contents clung to the veteran's jacket, yellow yolk seeping into the fabric, bacon grease darkening the already frayed cloth. The bikers leaned back in their seats, laughter loud and jagged, testing the edges of the moment. They had crafted the accident perfectly, obvious enough to humiliate, careless enough to feign innocence if challenged. Every eye in the room turned toward the man in the corner booth, waiting for the explosion that had to come. But it didn't. He did not leap to his feet, fists clenched, ready to meet the provocation head-on. He did not curse, did not raise his voice to demand justice from the men who had singled him out. Instead, he reached slowly, his hand steady as he pulled a napkin from the dispenser. The simple square of paper looked small in his scarred fingers, yet he unfolded it with deliberate care, as though it were cloth at a formal table. He pressed against the stain, dabbing, folding it over, dabbing again, methodical as a man accustomed to small, precise routines. The biker's laughter faltered, just for a second. The absence of rage, the refusal to meet them on their chosen ground, unsettled them in a way they had not expected. One gave a sharp whistle, mocking. Another muttered something about. Two broke in a fight back, and their laughter resumed, but thinner this time, forced. They had wanted a show, the kind of confrontation that would set the diner buzzing for weeks, and instead, they had been given silence. Maria watched from beside him, rag clutched tight in her hand. She wanted to speak, to snap at the bikers, to throw their meals back into the kitchen, but something in the man's stillness stopped her. His calm was not weakness. It was control. She saw it in the way his shoulders remained square, in the way his jaw never tightened, in the way he treated the humiliation not as a wound, but as another burden to be carried quietly. A few of the regulars shifted uncomfortably. The older woman stirring her tea set her spoon down and looked away, ashamed to watch. The farmers at the counter exchanged glances, each realizing the whispers they had shared earlier about trouble seemed hollow now. The teenagers in the booth whispered nervously, but even their voices softened, drawn by the strange gravity of the man's refusal to break. He continued blotting at the stain until the worst of it was absorbed. Then he folded the napkin neatly, tucking the mess inward, and set it on the edge of the table with the precision of someone completing a task. His hands returned to the mug, wrapping around it again, reclaiming its warmth as though nothing had happened. The diner filled again with the ordinary sounds of forks, scraping and coffee being poured. But it wasn't the same. The silence he had offered had altered the air. It made the bikers louder, more restless, their laughter rising higher to cover the hollowness they felt. It made the customers quieter, their glances sharper, their judgment no longer directed at the man in the corner, but at those who had tried and failed to break him. The veteran did not look at them, not once. He kept his head bowed, his focus steady, as though the only thing that mattered in that moment was a coffee in front of him. Yet the silence he carried became a weight the entire room could feel, a statement louder than fury, sharper than any insult, and it left everyone wondering how much strength it took to answer cruelty with nothing but calm. The laughter at the corner booth had not given them what they wanted. The silence of the man, his careful way of folding the stained napkin as though it mattered more than their mockery, had thrown something back at them they couldn't name. It was not victory, but it was not defeat either. It was a refusal, and refusal sting. So they pushed harder. One of them, younger than the rest, his beard patchy and uneven, raised his hand suddenly to his forehead in a sloppy gesture. His palm faced the wrong way. His elbow stuck out at an odd angle. At ease, "Sergeant of the sidewalk," he barked, his voice carrying clear across the diner. The words hit the air like a thrown stone, shattering what calm had been rebuilt after the spill. His companions erupted, pounding the tables with their fists, the sound thundering off the diner's narrow walls. Another joined in, pushing back from his booth just far enough to stand. He straightened his back, puffed out his chest, and raised his arm in an exaggerated arc before snapping his hand to his brow with theatrical precision. "Permission to speak, sir," he shouted, wobbling as though drunk on his own humor. The room shook with laughter from their table, harsh and jagged, the kind that demanded an audience. They looked around, waiting for others to join in, but the rest of the diner sat in uneasy silence. The veteran did not lift his eyes. His head remained bent, his hand steady around his mug, though his jaw tightened for just a moment, barely visible beneath the shadow of his unkempt hair. The bikers missed it, or perhaps ignored it, too busy outdoing one another. Betty used to lead parades. Another jeered, his hand flicking up in a half salute, elbow bent lazily. Now, he just leads the line at the shelter. The joke drew another round of laughter, though thinner now, less certain. Still, they clung to it, trying to force her cruelty into something entertaining. The words "Sarge of the Sidewalk" repeated again and again, each voice tossing it like a ball across the table, each laugh chasing after it as if to keep it alive. Maria stood behind the counter, her knuckles white against the handle of the coffee pot. She felt the urge to slam it down, to end the mockery with her own voice. But she caught herself. The man in the corner had chosen silence, and she would not rob him of it. She moved instead with quiet precision, refilling a cup here, setting down toast there, her eyes sharp as she passed their table. At the counter, one of the farmers muttered, "Idiots!" low enough that only his companion heard. The teenagers had gone completely still, their earlier whispers replaced with wide-eyed stares, their cocoa forgotten. The older woman stirred her tea again, the spoon clinking nervously against porcelain, her gaze locked firmly on the table rather than the corner booth. The bikers raised their hands again in mock salutes, one after the other, the motion sloppy, the laughter desperate. They had turned their cruelty into a performance, but without the response they craved, it began to falter. Their voices rose louder, filling the void where his fury should have been, but all they managed was to reveal their own unease. The veteran did not move. His silence was not weakness, but endurance, the kind of stillness forged in places where chaos had been louder than anything this diner could hold. He sipped his coffee, lowered the mug, and set it back on the table with the same deliberate care as before. The small sound of ceramic against formica cut through their noise, sharper than any shout. The laughter stumbled for just a second, and in that fall to the room felt a shift. They had mocked his service, mocked his silence, mocked the dignity he held on to, yet he had given them nothing in return, nothing but calm. And calm, in that moment, was more powerful than all their salutes combined. Maria had seen enough. The laughter from the bikers had worn thin, not only because of the cruelty behind it, but because of how it twisted the air inside the diner. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was poison, filling every corner until even the regulars couldn't pretend to ignore it. She had watched the veteran sit through every insult, every smirk, every mock salute with the same steady calm, but she could feel the weight of it pressing on the room. Something inside her snapped, not with anger at him, but with a rising fury at them. She set down the coffee pot she had been holding, the glass clinking against the counter a little harder than she meant. Her apron shifted as she turned, wiping her damp hands against the fabric. The bikers were still laughing, one of them midway through another sloppy salute, his friends pounding the table in amusement. She stepped closer, her shoes clicking softly against the worn linoleum, and stopped just beside their booth. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, but sharp enough to cut through their noise. "That's enough," she said. The laughter paused, though only briefly. The men turned their heads toward her, eyes narrowing, grins stretching wider, as though she had given them something new to toy with. One leaned back against the booth, folding his arms across his broad chest. "What's that, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice drawn out, mocking. "Didn't catch that." Maria steadied her breath. Her heart was hammering, but she refused to step back. She raised her chin slightly, her eyes meeting his without wavering. "I said leave him alone." The room went still. Conversations that had threatened to restart died on lips. Forks hovered above plates, unmoving. The biker who had spoken leaned closer, his grin twisting into something sharper. "We're just having a little fun," he said. "Man doesn't seem to mind." He jerked his chin toward the corner booth where the veteran still sat, hands around his coffee, unmoved by the attention. Maria's hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them at her sides to keep the movement hidden. "It's not fun," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying farther than she expected. "It's harassment, and it stops here." Her words cut across the diner, sharp and trembling at once, the kind of tone that left no room for misunderstanding. A few of the customers shifted in their seats, surprise flickering across their faces. The farmers at the counter exchanged glances, one nodding faintly in her direction. The teenagers leaned forward, their eyes wide, as though watching a scene they'd never dared imagine. Someone standing up to men like these. The bikers laughed again, but the sound was thinner, forced. One of them raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there," he said, smirking. "Didn't know the coffee came with lectures." Another chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess Mama Bear's gotta protect her stray." The words rolled across the room, meant to sting, but the edges dulled against her determination. Maria didn't flinch. Her voice lowered, steadier now, though still threaded with the tremor of her anger. "You've had your fun. Now let the man drink his coffee in peace." Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of the grill in the kitchen and the steady patter of rain against the windows. The bikers exchanged glances, smirks fading slightly, as if weighing whether to push further or let it drop. Their leader, the broad man with tattoos winding up his neck, drummed his fingers against the table, the sound deliberate, thoughtful. He didn't answer right away, letting the tension hang until it seemed the entire room was leaning toward him. Maria stood her ground, every muscle tight, her breath shallow but unbroken. She had spoken, and in speaking, she had shifted the balance. The man in the corner hadn't needed her defense. She knew that, but the rest of the diner had. And in that moment, she had drawn a line no one else had dared to, telling them in no uncertain terms that cruelty would not rule her floor. The laughter thinned into a kind of restless muttering. The bikers unsettled by Maria's sudden sharpness, yet unwilling to admit it. Their voices dropped, still mocking but without the same energy, like men who had spent themselves trying to provoke a reaction that never came. The veteran sat unmoved in the corner, his coffee cooling in its chipped mug, his stillness pressing more heavily on the room than any words could have. The rain outside softened, dripping steadily now instead of hammering the windows, and the quiet rhythm of it seemed to settle into the silence he carried with him. He shifted slightly in his seat, reaching for the canvas pack that rested against the wall. Its fabric was worn thin, frayed along the seams, the kind of bag that had seen too many years of weather and road. He pulled it closer, setting it on the bench beside him. The strap had twisted during the earlier commotion, and he tugged at it absently, fingers steady, adjusting it into place. As he did, the zipper gave a faint rasp, slipping partway open. Something inside shifted with the motion, a dull thud against the side of the bag, and then it slid free. A small leather case, scuffed and weathered, tumbled forward onto the seat. The latch gave way when it hit, the lid cracking open just enough of the contents to catch the light. For the briefest moment, a gleam cut across the dimness of Booth, gold against dark leather, unmistakable in its shape and shine. Those nearest to him saw it first. One of the farmers at the counter froze mid-bite, fork suspended halfway to his mouth. A teenager in the back Booth leaned forward, squinting, his cocoa forgotten. Even Maria, busy at the counter pouring coffee into a customer's mug, caught the glint out of the corner of her eye and went still. The diner, for that fragile instant, seemed to hold its breath again. The metal wasn't fully revealed, just a corner of the star, the ribbon's edge folded beneath it. But it was enough. Anyone who had ever seen a picture of it, in newspapers or on television, would recognize what it was. A Medal of Honor was not something that could be mistaken for trinket or toy. Its shine carried with it history, sacrifice, the weight of countless stories that were rarely told aloud. The veteran moved quickly but not with panic. His hand closed over the case, steady and sure as he tucked it back into the pack. He zipped the canvas shut with a quiet rasp, setting the bag down as though nothing unusual had happened. His head dipped once more, his hands returning to the mug, resuming his silence. Yet the glimpse could not be erased. The bikers noticed, too, though not all at once. One, seated closest to the corner, squinted and frowned. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, nudging his friend. Another chuckled dismissively, shaking his head. "Fake junk," he said loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Guy probably picked it up at a pawn shop." Their laughter returned, but it rang less certain now, thinner, like they were trying to convince themselves as much as the room. Maria's hands trembled faintly as she set down the coffee pot. She had seen it clearly. She knew what it meant, even if the men who mocked him refused to believe it. Around the diner, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Customers sat straighter, eyes lingering on the veteran not with suspicion, but with something closer to awe. They hadn't needed to know his name, but the star in that leather case had spoken more loudly than any defense could. The veteran gave no sign he had noticed their stares. He sipped his coffee as though the metal had never fallen into sight, as though its gleam carried no weight at all. But the room knew differently. The secret he carried was no longer entirely his own, and though he had tried to return it to silence, silence was no longer enough to hide it. For a fleeting moment, the diner no longer smelled of bacon grease and coffee. It smelled of history, of something larger than the small-town chatter that usually filled its corners. The metal had slipped into view only briefly, but that briefness was enough. The gold star, dulled at its edges yet still catching the dim light, flashed across the booth like a signal flare. Its ribbon, creased and faded from years of careful folding, carried dust in its fabric. The kind of dust that spoke not of neglect but of time spent hidden away, preserved only because the man who carried it could not bring himself to display it. The star was no decoration bought in a store. It bore a weight every eye in the room could sense, even if most had only ever seen it in photographs or framed behind glass at a courthouse wall. A Medal of Honor was a symbol almost mythical in its rarity, something tied to sacrifice beyond imagining, the kind of thing that ordinary people never encountered in their daily lives. And here it was, resting in the booth of a diner, nearly camouflaged among worn fabric and cracked leather. The farmers at the counter exchanged quick looks, the older of the two lowering his fork with a slow reverence he didn't fully understand. The teenagers, restless only moments before, stared with open mouths, the noise of their whispering silenced by awe. Even the cook leaned forward in a small past window, his spatula paused midair. Maria's eyes locked on it most of all, her breath caught, her body rooted to the spot as though moving too quickly might break the spell of what they had all just seen. The bikers noticed, but not with the same reverence. One of them leaned forward, his brow furrowed, squinting as though trying to make sense of it. Then he barked a laugh, slapping his friend on the arm. "Look at that," he sneered. "Our sidewalk sergeant carries props." Another joined in, his voice dripping with derision. "You can buy those online for $50. Probably keeps around to make suckers think he was somebody." Their laughter came again, loud and unrestrained, but it lacked the bite it had carried before. There was an unease beneath it, a recognition that their words rang false in a room where no one else shared their amusement. The veteran's hand moved steadily, no faster than it needed to, as he lifted the leather case and pressed it shut. His fingers curled around it firmly, his thumb brushing the latch with the care of someone who had done so countless times. He slipped it back into the canvas pack, the zip of the bag closed with finality, and placed it on the bench beside him. Then, as though nothing had happened, he returned to his mug, lifting it again, eyes lowered, posture unchanged. But the glimpse lingered. The metal might have been hidden, but its memory hung heavy in the air. The customers could not unsee the star, the ribbon, the quiet dignity with which it had been handled. They whispered nothing, yet their silence spoke louder than the biker's laughter. Respect had crept into the space, uninvited but undeniable. It weighed on everyone differently. For some, it brought shame for the whispers they had muttered earlier. For others, it was wonder at being in the presence of something they had only known as legend. The bikers grew louder in response. Their mockery pitched higher, almost desperate. "A medal don't buy you a meal," one said, shaking his head. Another grinned, though his eyes didn't match his mouth. Guess it didn't buy him a roof either. They tried to keep the room tethered to their cruelty, but the balance had shifted. Their words felt smaller now, petty against the gravity of what had been revealed. Maria caught the veteran's eyes for a brief moment as he set his cup down. There was no pride in his look, no demand that anyone acknowledge what had been seen. If anything, there was reluctance, as though he regretted the medal's brief escape from its hiding place. He had never wanted it to define him, and yet the room now pulsed with the knowledge of who he must be. The star had glinted once, and once was enough. Hidden again in dust and leather, it remained unseen, but it had already spoken for him in a language louder than any shout, more piercing than any insult. And though he had tucked it quickly away, the truth of it lingered, reshaping the silence in the diner into something heavier, something unshakable. The moment the metal disappeared back into the pack, the air inside the diner changed. The weight of what had been seen still hung there, heavy, undeniable. A few customers sat straighter in their seats, no longer pretending to eat. Others lowered their eyes, ashamed they had once muttered about drifters and trouble. Even the rain outside seemed quieter, as though it too had recognized the significance of that gleam of gold. But at the bikers' booth, unease was not something they were willing to allow. One of them, a stockier man with tattoos curling across the backs of his hands, leaned forward and squinted toward the corner booth where the veteran sat. He had caught the glint, had seen the way others had gone still, but his mind refused to linger there. Admitting what it was meant admitting something he didn't want to believe, that the man they mocked was someone who had earned more honor than they could ever touch. So he laughed instead, harsh and dismissive. "Relax," he said to the others, his voice pitched to cut through the silence that had fallen. "You see that junk? Probably bought it out of a pawn shop. Seen a dozen of them on eBay. Some kid in his basement stamping them out." His words carried farther than he intended, forcing the room to hear the excuse he was feeding himself. The laughter that followed wasn't immediate. His companions hesitated, glancing between one another, waiting for someone else to confirm. Then another let out a chuckle, quick and sharp, seizing onto dismissal like a lifeline. "Yeah," he added, nodding too eagerly. "Guy probably flashes that thing whenever he needs a free meal. Real clever scam." Their laughter built again, louder this time, forced into being by their need to drown out the doubt creeping in at the edges. They pounded the table as though to prove their confidence, their noise sharp against the fragile quiet of the room. But the sound didn't roll as smoothly as it had before. It grated, each burst of laughter mismatched, out of rhythm, desperate. Customers who had seen the metal with their own eyes exchanged quiet glances, unimpressed with the biker's denial. The truth of that star couldn't be erased by louder voices, no matter how hard they tried. Maria stood behind the counter, her hands braced against the wood, jaw tight. She had seen the metal clearly, had no doubt of what it meant, and the biker's attempt to paint it as fake stirred a fresh anger in her chest. But she stayed silent, watching, knowing the room was already shifting. The men could laugh as much as they wanted, but no amount of noise could fully convince the crowd. The veteran, for his part, did not move. He neither defended nor revealed, neither denied nor confirmed. He simply lifted his mug again, the steam long since faded, and drank in silence. That silence unsettled them most of all. If he had risen to argue, if he had claimed the metal as real, they could have mocked him harder, could have twisted his words. But his refusal to play their game left them scrambling, forced them to fill the gap with their own noise. One of the teenagers near the back leaned toward his friend and whispered, just loud enough for a few nearby to hear. "That was real. My dad showed me one once. That was it." The word spread in small ripples, not shouted, not claimed, but passed along quietly until the laughter fell hollower still. The bikers kept at it, their smirks fixed, their voices rising. But even they could sense the falter. Their performance no longer held the room the way it had before. The metal's brief glint had planted something heavier than their noise could cover. And though they tried to laugh louder, to call him pawn shop soldier and scam artist, each word landed thinner, each chuckle more strained. The balance had shifted, and the louder they got, the more everyone else in the diner began to hear the crack in their confidence. The diner, once a refuge from the rain and a place of small talk and coffee steam, had become a stage divided in two. The bikers filled their booth with noise, trying to laugh away the unease left behind by the glimpse of the metal. Their voices were sharp, cutting across the room, louder than necessary as though volume alone could erase doubt. On the other side sat the veteran in silence, his coffee cooling in its chipped mug, his eyes fixed downward, his presence steady. Between the two forces, the rest of the customers shifted, caught in the pull of conflict they neither wanted nor knew how to resolve. At the counter, the farmers leaned forward, their elbows pressed into the laminate surface, forks forgotten. One muttered, "Shouldn't let him keep it up," but his voice stayed low, meant only for his companion. The other shook his head, eyes still fixed on his plate. "Not our fight," he said, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. They had seen the metal as clearly as anyone. And though their hearts told them to intervene, fear told them to stay seated. In the back booth, the teenagers whispered furiously, their voices thin with nervous energy. "Did you see it? That was real, I swear," one insisted, his words stumbling over themselves. His friend nodded quickly, but neither dared to raise their voices. They wanted to believe they would stand up if pushed, that bravery would rise when needed. But in this moment they remained rooted, eyes darting between the veteran's quiet composure and the biker's forced bravado. The older woman with her tea stirred it slowly, the spoon clinking against porcelain in an uneven rhythm. She had been alive long enough to remember reading the names of Medal of Honor recipients in the newspaper, seeing photographs of young men in uniform who never came home. She recognized the star, even if only for a second, and it weighed heavily on her. Yet her lips stayed pressed shut. Her heart told her to rise, to say something, but she feared what would follow if she did. Maria moved between tables, her steps brisker than usual, her jaw set. Every instinct told her to put herself between the bikers and the man in the corner, to shout them down until their cruelty shriveled. But she had been in this diner too long not to understand how quickly men like them could turn violent when challenged. She kept her voice steady when speaking to customers, but her eyes flicked again and again toward the corner booth, her concern visible even in her silence. The bikers noticed a division. Their leader, the broad man with the tattooed neck, grinned as he scanned the room. He saw the unease, the way eyes avoided his gaze, the way voices stayed low, and it fed him. "Whole place loves a little soldier boy, huh?" he said, his tone mocking. "Funny how nobody wants to sit with him, though." His companions roared, slapping the table as if to claim ownership of the space. The laughter cut to the tension, but it did not erase it. The customer sat trapped between the desire to stop it and the fear of what standing up might bring. They told themselves that silence was safer, that it wasn't their place, that someone else would act if things went too far. Yet shame gnawed at them, shame that they would carry long after breakfast plates were cleared and rain dried from the roads outside. The veteran remained as he had all morning, silent, unmoved, his calm unbroken. His refusal to engage stood in stark contrast to the noise across the room, and though he had not asked for anyone's defense, his silence only made the division clearer. Half the diner wanted to rise beside him. The other half feared what would happen if they did. And so the room hung suspended, balanced uneasily between courage and cowardice, waiting for the moment when the weight would tip one way or the other. The room had grown heavy with the kind of tension that presses on the chest, making every breath feel shallow. The bikers had filled the air with laughter until it no longer sounded natural, until even their own voices betrayed the strain of forcing cruelty into humor. The rest of the diner sat divided, caught between the urge to speak and the fear of consequence. And in the middle of it all, the man in the corner remained still, a stone in the stream, untouched by the noise rushing around him. Then, without warning, he moved. It wasn't sudden or aggressive. There was no scrape of chair legs shoved angrily against tile, no outburst to announce what he was about to do. He simply placed both hands on the table, steady and deliberate, and pushed himself upward. The booth creaked faintly under the shift of his weight, and the room seemed to tighten as every eye turned toward him. He rose slowly, with the kind of deliberate control that made it clear he had done this countless times before, stood not to perform, not to intimidate, but because the moment required it. The bikers, still grinning and muttering among themselves, went quiet as they watched him straighten. His frame unfolded from the booth like a figure stepping out of shadow. He was taller than anyone had expected, broad across the shoulders, his posture commanding even in his frayed jacket and worn jeans. The lines of his face, hidden until now by the downward tilt of his head, caught the light, revealing scars etched faintly across skin weathered by years. The customers felt it instantly. He did not have to speak, did not have to glare or raise his fists. His presence alone shifted the balance of the room. He was not a drifter rising in anger, but a soldier standing as if answering a call. There was nothing hurried in his movements, no wasted energy. He stood with the stillness of a man accustomed to discipline, to patience, to waiting for the exact moment when motion mattered most. The bikers shifted in their seats, some leaning back, others narrowing their eyes. They had expected weakness, maybe fury, something they could laugh at or push against. Instead, they were met with calm strength, the kind that needed no noise to prove itself. One of them smirked again, but the grin looked thinner, forced. "Well, look at that," he muttered. "The sidewalk sergeant's got legs after all." His words tried to break the tension, but they landed flat, ignored by the rest of the room. The veteran didn't look at him. His gaze swept briefly across the diner, his eyes sharp, clear, a quiet acknowledgement of every face that had been watching him endure. He did not glare at the bikers. He did not seek their eyes with challenge. Instead, he stood steady, taller than their mockery, broader than their noise, and let the silence speak for him. Maria's hand tightened on the edge of the counter. She had seen him many times before, hunched low in the corner, his presence quiet enough to slip past the world. But standing now, she saw the man differently. Not broken, not beaten, but formidable in a way that explained the metal tucked into his bag, the scars he carried unseen. The diner held itself still, waiting for his next move. The bikers had tried to own the space with noise. Now he had claimed it back with silence and the undeniable weight of his presence. He did not need to fight. Simply by standing, he had shifted the balance of the room. And in that moment, the diner no longer belonged to them. It belonged to him. The veteran stood still for a long moment, the kind of stillness that pulled every sound out of the room. The hiss of the grill from the kitchen seemed distant now, the clink of silverware muted. Even the rain against the windows faded into the background. All eyes stayed fixed on him, waiting, though most didn't realize they were holding their breath. The bikers shifted in their seats, the bravado they carried in dripping away like the rain from their jackets. When he finally spoke, his voice carried low, gravelly, worn with years. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space all the same, pressing into every corner of the diner. "Respect," he said, the word hanging in the air, heavy. He paused, letting it sink before continuing. "It's not about fear, not about who can shout the loudest or laugh the longest. Respect is what you give those who carried weight you'll never understand." He didn't look directly at the bikers, though his words were meant for them. His eyes remained fixed somewhere ahead, as though he were speaking to memories rather than men. "I buried brothers, carried them across sand, through smoke, while bullets cut the air around us. I've watched boys younger than some of you, give everything so someone else could come home. That's what sacrifice looks like." His hand tightened on the back of the booth, knuckles pale, but his voice never rose. The bikers' laughter was gone. Their smirks faded under the weight of words not meant to impress, but to remind. Around the diner, customers shifted in their seats, their shame thick in the silence. Maria felt her chest tighten, her hands gripping her apron, eyes locked on him. She had sensed it for years, that weight he carried, the reason he sat alone, always so quiet. Now the truth of it echoed through the room, undeniable. He drew in a breath, slow and steady, his eyes closing briefly as if gathering something within. "Silence," he went on, softer now. "That's what's left when the guns stop. It's the sound you remember most. The silence after the shouting, after the explosions, after the names stopped being answered at roll call." His voice cracked slightly, not with weakness, but with memory too heavy to polish smooth. "You learn to live with silence. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you standing." The room had become a sanctuary for his words. No one moved, no one dared interrupt. Even the bikers sat frozen, their bravado stripped bare, left with nothing to shield them from what they were hearing. He wasn't scolding them, not exactly. He was telling them something they had never asked to hear, but could never unhear again. He lowered his gaze then, his voice dropping to a final rumble. "So when you mock me, when you spill your plates and throw your salutes, you're not mocking me alone. You mock every name I carry with me, every man who never made it back. And that's something I won't answer with anger. I answer it with silence, because silence is all they have left." He let the words hang, unchallenged, unbroken, before stepping back slightly, his posture still tall, still unyielding. The weight of what he had said settled over the diner like a stone, pressing down on every person present. And in that moment, silence no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to all of them. The diner was so still that even the rain outside seemed to hesitate. Each drop against the window, a faint reminder of the world beyond those walls. The veteran's words had settled into the room, leaving everyone caught between shame and awe. For a moment it seemed he would sit back down, retreat again into his silence. Instead, he drew a slow breath, and when he spoke, the words came differently this time, not as explanations but as offerings. Carson, he said, the name heavy on his tongue. James Carson. He was 19. Carried photographs of his high school sweetheart, folded so many times the creases wore through the paper. Died holding them in his hand. The veteran's eyes fixed on a point far beyond the room, as though he could still see it happening, as though it were unfolding again in the silence between his words. He paused, the air thick. Then another name. Ortiz. Manuel Ortiz. Father of 2 little girls. He used to hum them lullabies into a recorder before deployment. Said he wanted them to fall asleep to his voice even if he never came home. They did for a while, but he never came home. His voice cracked faintly, but he steadied it, the weight of the memory pushing through. The bikers didn't laugh now. They didn't move. Their eyes stayed fixed on him, their bravado stripped away by the sound of names that were no longer just words but lives. Green, the veteran went on. Thomas Green. He could run for miles, faster than anyone. Always first in line, always grinning, even when he had no reason to. He never made it back from the valley. I still see him sometimes, running ahead, too fast for the rest of us to catch. His hand brushed the edge of the booth, fingers curling slightly as though holding on to something unseen. The customers sat with their heads bowed, each one caught in the gravity of his voice. Maria's eyes stung as she gripped her apron, listening to names that turned strangers into brothers she would never meet, yet suddenly knew. He went on, each word measured, each name carved into the silence like scripture. Daniels, Carter, Lou, Henderson. With each one, he gave a fragment of who they were, small details that clung to memory long after uniforms and ranks faded. A laugh, a song, a habit, a fear. They were not soldiers in his telling. They were men, young and fragile and human, who had left pieces of themselves behind. By the time he stopped, the diner felt transformed. The bikers stared at the table now, their smirks gone, their hands still. The regulars shifted uneasily, guilt pressing down heavier than before. The teenagers who had been whispering earlier now sat silent, their cocoa long gone cold. The veteran exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling with the weight of the names he had carried for years. These are the voices I live with, he said at last, quieter now, almost himself. They don't let me forget, and I won't let anyone else mock them into silence. The words were not meant as a threat, nor even as a defense. They were a vow, spoken into a room that had no choice but to listen. The names lingered there long after his voice fell quiet, etched into the walls, into hearts of everyone present, carried now by more than just him. The veteran's words had rolled through the diner like a tide, and when they receded, they left behind a silence deeper than anything the little room had ever known. The clatter of forks against plates had stopped, as though every hand had frozen mid-motion. Even the steady hum of the refrigerator in the back seemed to shrink into the background, no longer noticeable until its absence made the stillness sharper. Conversations that filled the air just an hour earlier were gone. Not a whisper, not a murmur dared arise. Every face was turned toward him, some openly, some with furtive glances that flickered and fell away. The customers sat rooted in their seats, shoulders hunched not from the cold but from the weight of what they had just heard. Maria stood behind the counter, her hand gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white, but she didn't move, didn't speak. The bikers who had entered with roaring engines and louder voices now sat subdued, their laughter cut short, their mouths tight as though words had abandoned them. The man himself stood at the corner booth, tall, unmoving, hands loose at his sides. He had spoken his piece, offered his memories like stones placed gently on a grave, and now he waited, not for applause, not for pity, but for quiet, and the quiet obeyed him. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, tapping lightly against the window panes. The sound was delicate, almost reverent, as though nature itself had leaned close to listen. Inside, the air was thick with reverence and shame, and though no one would admit it aloud, Each person knew they had been changed by what they heard. The bikers shifted uncomfortably. One drummed his fingers on the table, but stopped after a moment, realizing the sound echoed too harshly in the stillness. Another cleared his throat, but the noise seemed out of place, drawing a glare from his own companions. They had made themselves kings of noise when they walked in, but now noise felt like the last thing they wanted to claim. The older woman with her tea lowered her spoon carefully, setting it against the saucer with more gentleness than was necessary. The farmers at the counter stared into their coffee cups, their faces tight, their earlier grumblings about drifters now sounding like sins whispered into the dark. The teenagers sat forward, eyes wide, their silence not from fear, but from awe, the kind of awe reserved for legends who walked among them without asking to be noticed. Even Maria, who had always defended him in small, quiet ways, felt something shift within her. She had suspected his silence carried stories, but she had never expected to hear them spoken aloud. Now, as she looked at him standing tall in his frayed jacket, she understood why he never needed to explain himself, why he always chose a far booth, why his silence had been stronger than words. The fridge clicked on again, its hum returning to fill the emptiness, but no one heard it the same. The noise was a reminder that life continued, that the diner was still just a place of coffee and eggs and rainy mornings. Yet under that sound lived something deeper, an echo of names recited, of sacrifice described, of silence honored. For one suspended moment, the entire diner existed as a single heartbeat, still and listening, waiting to see what would come next. And though no one could name it, they all knew they had stepped into a space that was no longer ordinary, a space where respect had been demanded not by force but by truth. The silence, once awkward and heavy, had become sacred, a silence every person in the room carried with them, afraid to be the first to break it. Maria had stood frozen behind the counter, her heart hammering with every word the veteran spoke. She had known him longer than most in the diner, had served him more cups of coffee than she could count. He never offered stories, never shared details, but she had learned enough in the quiet years of his visits to piece together truths that others ignored. She had seen the way he carried himself, the precision in the smallest of gestures, the discipline behind his silence. She had known from the beginning that this was no ordinary drifter. And now, with the metal briefly revealed and his words lingering in the stillness, she realized the room deserved to know what she had always kept to herself. Her hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot. The clink of glass on the counter sounded too loud in the heavy quiet. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but when she spoke, her voice carried across the diner, sharper than she expected. "His name," she said, her eyes fixed not on the bikers, but on everyone else, "is Daniel Hayes." The silence deepened, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, waiting. Maria's voice shook slightly, but she pressed on, her words steadying as they left her. "Sergeant First Class Daniel Hayes, United States Army, Medal of Honor, Afghanistan." Gasps rippled through the diner. A fork slipped from someone's hand and clattered against a plate, the noise startling in the stillness. The farmers at the counter turned sharply, their eyes wide with disbelief. The teenagers leaned forward, their mouths open, their earlier awe crystallizing into something fiercer. Even the older woman with her tea covered her lips with her hand, her eyes filling with tears she hadn't expected. The bikers went rigid. Their smirks collapsed into stunned stillness, their laughter smothered under the weight of what Maria had said. One opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. The dismissal they had clung to, their certainty that the medal was fake, that the man was a fraud, crumbled instantly. There was no denying the name, no denying the truth behind it. Maria's eyes swept the room, her voice firm now, the tremor gone. "I read about him years ago. It was in the paper, back when the war was still on the front page. They wrote about what he did that day, about how he pulled men from fire when the rest had fallen back, about how he went back again and again and again when no one thought he'd come out alive. They gave him the Medal of Honor because he earned it, because he carried lives on his back when others would have stopped." The customers shifted, stunned into reverence. No one spoke. No one dared to. The bikers, their arrogance drained, sat hunched in their booth, their eyes lowered to the table. The room had changed completely. Daniel Hayes did not look up. He did not acknowledge Maria's words or the gasps they had drawn. He stayed as he always did, quiet, still, unwilling to wear his honor like armor. But the truth hung in the air now, undeniable, large in the noise that had filled the diner earlier. His name, spoken aloud, had become its own shield, one stronger than silence could ever be. Maria exhaled, her chest tight, her hand still trembling slightly. She had carried his truth in her heart for years, protecting it without ever knowing if she should. But in that moment, with the room divided and cruelty threatening to eclipse respect, she had spoken it. And now everyone knew the man in the corner booth was not just a homeless veteran. He was Daniel Hayes, Medal of Honor, Afghanistan. And knowing his name changed everything. The words still hung in the air, as though Maria's voice had etched them into the walls themselves. Asterisk Daniel Hayes, Medal of Honor, Afghanistan. Asterisk the name carried a weight no insult could diminish, and the silence that followed was broken only by the sound of startled breaths. Gasps rippled softly through the diner, sharp intakes that betrayed recognition, memory, shame. A few whispered the name aloud, testing it against their own lips, as if confirming that they had truly heard it. The bikers were the first to move, though not with the confidence that had carried them through the door. Their boots shifted against the floor, a restless scrape of rubber and leather, their broad shoulders no longer leaning so easily against the booths. Bravado cracked at the edges, smirks faltering into tight lines as they avoided looking directly at the man they had mocked. The laughter that had once filled the space felt like an echo now, something embarrassing to remember rather than something to continue. Their leader clenched his jaw, tattoos rippling faintly as he ground his teeth, but even he kept his eyes fixed on the table. Around them, the customers reacted in their own ways. The older woman who had stirred her tea so nervously earlier now bowed her head, lips pressed together, her hands folded as though in prayer. The farmers at the counter exchanged looks heavy with regret, their earlier mutterings about trouble now burning against their conscience. One of them whispered, almost to himself, "I remember the paper, that valley." His companion nodded, swallowing hard, guilt written plainly across his face. The teenagers in the back booth leaned toward each other, their voices low and hushed, but their eyes wide with wonder. "It's him," one said. "That's his name." They repeated it in near reverence, their excitement tempered by the sacredness of what it meant. They would carry the story out of that diner, into the hallways of their school, into their homes, speaking the name as though it belonged to a legend who had somehow sat unnoticed in their small town all this time. Maria stood straighter now, her hands no longer trembling, though her heart still beat hard against her ribs. She didn't need to say anything further. The room had already absorbed the truth. She glanced at the man in the corner, at Daniel Hayes, and saw him still as stone, his eyes lowered, his posture unchanged. He gave no acknowledgement, no nod of thanks, no sign at all that he wanted recognition. Yet his stillness only deepened the reverence. He had carried this truth silently for years, never demanding it be spoken. The fact that it had emerged here, now, was enough. The bikers could feel the weight of the customers' stares pressing against them. Every smirk they had worn, every cruel word, every mocking salute, they all now seemed small, pathetic, revealed for what they were. Their laughter had been noise. His silence had been history. One of them rubbed the back of his neck. Uneasy, his earlier swagger drained away. Another picked at the edge of a paper napkin, tearing it into pieces with restless fingers. The leader drummed his hand once against the table, but it sounded weak, uncertain, quickly abandoned. Whispers passed between tables, not a mockery now, but of recognition. A few customers recalled the articles, the grainy photographs, the stories that had circulated years ago when Afghanistan still filled the headlines. "He saved his whole unit," someone murmured. "Went back under fire. I read about it." Another nodded, recalling the details not from a newspaper, but from the television. The solemn ceremony at the White House, the medal presented by steady hands. No one dared speak louder than a whisper, as if the man himself might vanish if they treated his presence like a spectacle. Respect, raw and unpolished, had replaced judgment. The bikers remained cornered by it, Their strength drained, their false confidence exposed under the weight of truth they could neither dismiss nor laugh away. And still Daniel Hayes said nothing. He let the whispers rise and fall, let the shame settle where it belonged, and kept his silence intact. It was a silence that needed no defense, no explanation, no permission. A silence earned, carried, and finally recognized whether the world was ready or not. The silence had grown so dense it felt like the diner itself was holding its breath. The air charged with something that could not be undone. Maria's words lingered in the minds of everyone present, each syllable etching itself into memory. Daniel Hayes, Medal of Honor, Afghanistan. The name had shifted the room, stripping away the bravado of the bikers and replacing judgment with shame. Yet still, for some, the weight of the truth needed proof. It came from the wall near the entrance, where a corkboard hung cluttered with yellowing advertisements and fading flyers. Lost dog notices with curled corners, church bake sale announcements months past, a half-torn poster for a local mechanic, all layered together into the kind of collage that small towns accumulated over years. Buried among them was something older still, a newspaper clipping, thumbtacked so long ago that the edges had browned and curled. It had been pinned there by Maria herself years earlier, though most had stopped noticing it. A man at the counter rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the board, his hand hovering before pulling the paper free. He studied it for a moment, brushing away the dust, before turning toward the room. "It's here," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hush. He held up the clipping for all to see. The photograph was black and white, its ink faded but clear enough to reveal a younger face. Daniel Hayes stood in crisp uniform, shoulders squared, medals aligned, eyes steady beneath the brim of his cap. He looked years younger, his hair shorter, his face unlined by time and hardship. Yet the resemblance was undeniable. The man in the picture and the man in the corner booth were one and the same. Gasps rippled again, but these were softer, filled not with shock, but with confirmation. Whispers broke out, this time not doubting, but remembering. "I saw that issue," someone murmured. "Front page," right after the ceremony. Another nodded. Their voice hushed. He was all over the news. Everyone talked about it for weeks. The teenagers in the back leaned forward, their wide eyes locked on the image, whispering to one another about how unreal it felt to see a living legend sitting only a few feet away. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the clipping and the man they had mocked. Their leader's smirk had vanished entirely. He clenched his jaw, but the tension in his face betrayed his unease. One of his companions muttered under his breath, the words too low to be caught, before sinking back into booth, his confidence gone. Maria stepped forward, wiping her hands against her apron, her expression unreadable. She looked at the clipping, then at Daniel, her voice steady but filled with quiet conviction. "I kept that there so no one would forget, but most stopped seeing it. Just another piece of paper on the wall." Her gaze lingered on him, softening. "You never wanted it mentioned, but the truth deserves air." Daniel Hayes didn't move. He didn't look at the clipping, didn't acknowledge the younger man frozen in newsprint. His hands remained wrapped around the chipped mug, steady as ever. His silence was not denial nor shame, but the same restraint he had carried since walking through the door. He didn't need to confirm what the paper showed. The room already knew. The man at the counter set the clipping down carefully on an empty table where all could see. Its faded edges lay flat against the surface. The photograph of valor now paired with the presence of man himself, older, weathered, but still standing. The room absorbed the weight of it, the proof tangible, undeniable. No one laughed. No one whispered in doubt. The clipping had spoken louder than any insult ever could, and in its faded ink, the truth was sealed. The man mocked as a drifter was, in fact, a soldier whose silence carried more than words ever could. The clipping lay on the table, like a mirror no one could avoid. The younger face in the photograph stared back at the room, eyes steady, uniform crisp, the Medal of Honor ribbon visible beneath his collar. There was no longer any room for doubt, no space left for laughter. The silence had deepened into something heavier, and in that weight, shame settled like a fog. The bikers sat trapped inside it. They had strutted in with noise and arrogance, filling the diner with their bravado, but now their power drained from them with each passing second. The leader, who had carried himself like the center of every room he entered, tapped his fingers against the table as if trying to find a rhythm to cover his unease. It didn't work. The sound came hollow, brittle, and quickly stopped. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed anywhere but the corner booth. One of the younger men, the same who had mocked the salute earlier, shifted in his seat. His hands fumbled at the brim of his cap, twisting it back and forth, before finally pulling it off. The gesture wasn't loud or dramatic, but it cut through the stillness. A hat removed is a gesture of respect, an admission of reverence, and though he didn't look at Daniel Hayes, the meaning was clear. He lowered his head slightly, the cap resting in his lap. His bravado collapsed into quiet regret. Another biker, broader and older, kept his eyes locked on the floor. His earlier smirks had drained into something pale. His posture hunched. His fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table, as though bracing against a weight pressing down on him. He didn't try to speak, didn't try to laugh it off. His silence was different now. Not the silence of mockery, but of a man confronted with the truth of his cruelty. The rest of the diner watched the transformation unfold. Customers who had once stayed quiet, too afraid to challenge the noise, now felt the tide shift. The farmers at the counter lowered their heads, their earlier whispers about drifters echoing back to them in shame. The older woman dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, whispering something softly to herself, perhaps a prayer, perhaps only the name she had just learned. The teenagers in the back booth leaned close, their whispers now reverent, carrying none of the nervous laughter that had marked their earlier chatter. Maria moved slowly from behind the counter, her steps careful, her expression solemn. She had seen men humble before, though rarely in this way. She didn't gloat, didn't press the moment further. Her eyes lingered on the biker with his hat in his lap, then on the one staring at the floor. They were not villains now, not in this silence. They were simply men confronted with the enormity of their own smallness. Daniel Hayes did not acknowledge any of it. He remained standing, his presence still steady, his hands loose at his sides. His silence continued, but now it was no longer only his own. It spread across the room, filling every heart, demanding reflection. He did not need to shame them. Their own actions had done that already. The biker with the tattoos up his neck shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if to speak, but no words came. He, too, dropped his eyes eventually, unable to meet the gaze of anyone in the diner, least of all the man he had tried to humiliate. The weight of shame pressed down on them all, not just the bikers, but every customer who had sat in silence too long. They felt it in the heaviness of their chests, in the way they avoided each other's eyes, in the knowledge that they had all played some part, whether through cruelty or through cowardice. And still Daniel Hayes gave them nothing but his silence. He stood as he had always stood, not demanding recognition, not reveling in their shame. He simply was, unshaken, as though his presence alone had been enough to remind them all of what they had forgotten. The silence had lingered so long that it began to feel permanent, like the air itself had thickened into something no one dared disturb. The bikers sat under it, stripped of their swagger, their voices buried beneath the weight of what had been revealed. Their boots no longer tapped against the floor. Their laughter was gone, replaced with restless shifting, hands fidgeting with napkins or caps. The customers had grown still too, waiting, watching, as though unsure whether the moment would end in apology or retreat. The leader, the one with tattoos crawling up his neck and eyes that had carried defiance when he first walked in, sat rigid in the booth. He had been the loudest of them, the one who had set the tone with his mockery, and now that same energy had turned inward, nodding in his chest. He looked at the man in the corner, at Daniel Hayes, though he could hardly bring himself to think the name, and felt his throat tighten. He had seen many men stand their ground, but none like this. Not a man who fought back with fists or words, but one who fought with silence, patience, and truths heavier than steel. For a long moment, he simply stared at the table, at the ring of condensation left by his glass. His companions glanced toward him, waiting for him to speak, but none dared push him. Finally, with a slow exhale, he pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood against tiles startled the quiet, drawing every eye back toward him. He stood, the weight of his leather jacket pulling at his shoulders, and for the first time since entering, He did not look larger than life. He looked smaller, uncertain, his bravado drained away. He took a step toward the corner booth, his boots heavy against the floor, though now each step carried hesitation rather than swagger. When he reached the table, he stopped, his jaw clenched, his hands shifting restlessly. For a moment he said nothing, the silence pressing harder against him, demanding honesty. At last he spoke, and his voice was rough, uncertain, stripped of its earlier sharpness. Let me cover your meal," he said. The words stumbled from his mouth, unsteady. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Whatever it is, I'll pay it." His eyes didn't quite meet Daniel's. They hovered somewhere near the chipped mug on the table, as though he couldn't bear the weight of looking directly at the man he had mocked. The offer was clumsy, inadequate, but it was all he had. He didn't know how to undo the laughter, the spilled food, the taunts that had poisoned the room. He didn't know how to erase the image of the metal glinting in the dim light, or the sound of names spoken like scripture. All he could do was extend his hand in the smallest gesture of respect, fumbling for something that might lessen the weight of shame pressing down on him. The room watched closely. The farmers leaned forward slightly, their brows furrowed. The teenagers in the back whispered nothing, their eyes wide, waiting to see how the moment would end. Maria stood near the counter, her heart pounding, her breath caught. Daniel Hayes did not move immediately. He let the words hang, his silence heavier than any reply. His eyes remained lowered, but his posture was steady, unshaken. At last, he lifted his gaze just slightly, enough for the leader to feel it, and in that glance was something unreadable. Not anger, not forgiveness, but a reminder that respect could not be bought, not with money, not with words hastily offered. The biker's hand lingered awkwardly at his side, his shoulders tense. He had extended the offer, unsure if it was enough, knowing deep down that it wasn't. It was not payment for a meal he owed, but for dignity he had tried to strip away. And in that stillness, as the room waited for Daniel's response, the leader realized that sometimes a hand extended could feel heavier than a clenched fist. The leader's words lingered in the air, fragile, uncertain, as though he himself doubted their worth. His hand twitched slightly at his side, fingers curling and uncurling, as if waiting for an answer that would absolve him. The rest of the diner stayed silent. Every face turned toward the corner booth, waiting to see how Daniel Hayes would respond. The offer hung there like an unbalanced weight, teetering between apology and insult, desperate to bridge the gulf but failing to understand the depth of it. Daniel looked at the chipped mug in front of him, its rim stained faintly with cooled coffee. He let the moment stretch, not out of cruelty, but because silence was the only way to strip pretense from a room. Only when the weight had fully settled did he lift his gaze. His eyes met the biker's at last, steady, unflinching, not hostile, but piercing enough to still a man where he stood. "I don't need your money," he said, his voice low and rough, gravel worn down by years. The words were simple, but they landed harder than any shout could have. The leader shifted, his boots scuffing faintly against the floor, his shoulders tense under the dripping leather jacket. Daniel's hand rested lightly on the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the worn surface. "I've carried men out of places you can't imagine," he went on. "I've held them when they bled, listened to them call for their mothers with their last breaths. I've seen what can't be bought. Not with every dollar in this town, not with all the gold in this country. Respect," he said, pausing just long enough for the word to echo, "is all I ask. Not pity, not coins tossed like scraps. Respect." The biker's hand fell to his side, his earlier gesture of offering feeling suddenly small, almost childish. He nodded faintly, unable to find words, his eyes cast downward. Around the diner, no one moved. The farmers at the counter lowered their heads, shame rising in their faces. The older woman with her tea dabbed her eyes again, the napkin trembling in her hands. Even the teenagers, who had never known war beyond stories from their parents, understood the weight of what had just been said. Daniel's voice grew quieter, but no less firm. "You can laugh at me, spill your food on me, call me names until your throats are raw. I'll live with it. I've lived with worse. But when you mock me, when you mock the silence I carry, you're mocking the men whose names I've spoken, men who can't stand here to demand respect themselves." He let the sentence fade, his eyes lowering again, his hands folding around the mug as though nothing more needed to be said. The leader swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, his voice caught somewhere between apology and surrender, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded once more and stepped back, his shoulders heavier now, his step slower as he returned to his booth. His companions avoided his eyes, each one feeling the sting of his refusal as much as their own mockery. The rest of the diner exhaled quietly, though no one dared break the silence with chatter. Daniel had refused riches, had dismissed pity as worthless, leaving only one truth behind. That respect was not currency, not charity, not something to be bartered. It was the one thing owed freely, the one thing that gave dignity back to men who had carried more than most could bear. And in the quiet that followed, every person in the diner understood it. The diner's air felt too tight to hold them any longer. The tension that had once belonged to laughter and jeers had turned to silence and weight. Every customer knew it, felt it in the stiffness of their shoulders, in the way their forks lay untouched on half-eaten plates. Even the bikers seemed out of place now, their swagger drained, their presence reduced to uneasy glances and restless shifting in their seats. The leader, who had offered payment with faltering words, no longer looked at the man in the corner. Instead, he stared at the table, his jaw set in a way that betrayed more than he wanted to admit. At last, the scrape of a chair broke the stillness. One biker pushed himself up slowly, not with the loud, deliberate force of before, but with a kind of caution. His boots thudded softly against the linoleum as he moved toward the door. Another followed, then another, each movement subdued, their eyes fixed anywhere but on Daniel Hayes. The rain outside could be heard again, faint through the glass, as if it had been waiting for them to notice it. The leader was the last to rise. He hesitated, his hand resting briefly on the edge of the booth as though reluctant to let go of the space they had once owned so easily. His gaze flicked toward Daniel for briefest moment, then away again, unable to meet the weight of those eyes. He muttered something too low for anyone to catch, then turned toward the door. The bell above it gave a dull jingle as they stepped out into the rain. Water splattered against their leather jackets, running down in streams, soaking through patches and seams. Their engines waited in the lot, hulking shadows under the gray drizzle. Yet when they mounted their bikes, there was no roar, no show of power. The engines turned over quietly, their growl muted, as though even the machines knew better than to disturb what had been left inside. Through the diner's windows, the customers watched. Some leaned slightly in their seats, others kept their eyes fixed on their plates, but no one spoke. The rain streaked across the glass, blurring the outlines of the men outside, making them appear smaller, less certain. Their power diminished under the sky's steady downpour. Maria stood at the counter, her hands folded against her apron, her eyes following them as they moved. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction in their retreat. What had happened was not victory, but revelation. The men leaving carried with them their shame, and though they would mount their bikes and vanish down the road, they could never outrun the silence that had met them here. The engines rumbled, low and subdued, a far cry from the thunder that had first shaken the windows. One by one, the bikes rolled from the lot, tires splashing water, exhaust curling weakly in the damp air. The leader lingered a moment longer, his head bent slightly, then twisted the throttle just enough to follow the others. Together, they disappeared into the rain, their departure swallowed quickly by the gray morning. Inside, the diner felt both emptier and fuller at once. The absence of noise was almost startling, yet in its place lingered something deeper, something that bound everyone present. The bikers had walked out subdued, their engines quiet. But what remained behind was louder than any of them could have imagined. Silence, respect, and the memory of a man who had asked for nothing more. The rain had softened into a mist that clung to the glass, blurring the view of the parking lot. The engines outside idled low, their growl reduced to little more than a murmur. Inside, the diner held its silence, the weight of the moment still pressing down like a hand on every shoulder. No one spoke, no one dared to move too quickly, as though breaking the stillness might undo what had just taken place. Daniel Hayes remained standing in the corner, his presence alone anchoring the room, his hands loose at his sides, his face calm. Through the fog window, the bikers loomed as dark shapes, their leather jackets slick with rain. They adjusted their seats, tugged at their gloves, kept their eyes fixed on anything but the diner behind them. Yet the leader, the one who had mocked the loudest and laughed the hardest, lingered. He had not yet lowered his gaze to the handlebars of his motorcycle. Instead, he turned his head back toward the diner, his face caught somewhere between defiance and regret. For a long moment, he didn't move. The rain streaked down his temples, cutting through the ingot tattoos, washing away what little was left of his bravado. He lifted his hand slowly, as though testing whether he had the strength to finish the gesture. His fingers shook faintly, but then the motion steadied, his palm flattening, his elbow bending into place. It was not sloppy this time, not exaggerated or mocking. It was a salute, sharp, deliberate, held with the sincerity of a man who had finally understood the weight of what he had ridiculed. Inside, the customer saw it. One of the farmers at the counter drew in a quiet breath. The older woman set her napkin down, her lips parting in surprise. The teenagers pressed closer to the glass, their faces lit with the awe of witnessing something rare. Even Maria, still at the counter, felt her chest tighten as she recognized a shift in the man outside. This was not performance. It was surrender, acknowledgement, a fractured attempt at respect. The salute lingered longer than expected, rain sliding from his fingers, his eyes locked on the diner window, as though trying to reach the man within. He did not smile, did not smirk. He held it until his hand trembled, then lowered it slowly, the gesture collapsing into the rain-soaked morning. Without a word, he mounted his bike, twisted the throttle, and joined the others already pulling away. Daniel Hayes did not return the salute. He did not move, did not shift his gaze from the mug on his table. His silence was his answer, his refusal to turn the moment into ceremony. But those who watched knew he had seen it, knew he had understood. The man who had mocked him most cruelly had been broken down by the truth, and in that breaking had given something back. Not enough to erase the harm, but enough to admit he had been wrong. The engines rolled away, one by one, their sound fading into the distance until all that remained was the patter of rain and the breath of the diner itself. The salute, brief and unadorned, remained in the minds of everyone present, burned there like an image too heavy to forget. It was not absolution, but it was recognition, and that was enough. The diner seemed larger once the engines faded into the distance, as if the walls themselves exhaled when the bikers were gone. The steady patter of rain returned as the only sound outside, a quiet rhythm against the windows that seemed gentler than before. Inside, the silence lingered, heavy and reverent. The corner booth still held its weight, though the man who had occupied it now stood near the door, slipping his worn boots back onto his feet with the same deliberate care he had shown all morning. No one stopped him. No one called after him. They simply watched as he adjusted his pack, pulled his frayed jacket tight, and stepped into the drizzle without a word. The bell above the door gave a faint ring as it closed behind him. Its sound thinned the vast hush that followed. For a long moment, the booth remained untouched, his presence lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. The chipped mug sat on the table, a ring of coffee staining the formica beneath it, a folded napkin, still blotched faintly with grease and yolk, lay neatly to one side. His silence was still there, even in his absence, etched into the space as surely as if he had carved it into the wood. Maria moved slowly toward the booth. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from weariness, but from the weight of what the space had come to mean. She reached out and lifted the mug, still faintly warm, and for a moment she didn't move. Her eyes lingered on the seat, the faint damp from his jacket still darkening the vinyl cushion. She set the mug on her tray, but her hand rested briefly on the back of the booth before she pulled it away. No one else in the diner spoke. The farmers at the counter kept their heads low. The teenagers still sat wide-eyed, and the older woman with her tea dabbed quietly at her face. Every person seemed to know that this was not an ordinary clearing of dishes, not just a routine of a waitress tidying after a customer had gone. This was something closer to ceremony. Maria picked up the napkin last, folding it on itself as though handling something sacred. She held it for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line, then whispered so softly the words barely rose above the rain. "Thank you." No one else heard it. No one else was meant to. It was not for the farmers or the teenagers or even the room itself. It was for him, for the man who had carried silence like a shield and laid truth across their tables like scripture. When she turned back toward the counter, her tray in hand, she kept her eyes lowered. She didn't want anyone to see the glisten at the corners of her eyes, didn't want them to mistake her quiet gratitude for weakness. She knew he would never ask for thanks, never linger for recognition. But she also knew that leaving the booth empty without speaking the words aloud would have felt like letting the moment vanish into nothing. The booth remained, its emptiness louder than the laughter that had once tried to fill the diner. In that silence, every person understood what Maria had whispered, even if they hadn't heard it. The thanks belonged to all of them now, carried in the empty space he had left behind. And though the man had walked out into the rain, the booth stood as his echo, a reminder that sometimes the greatest presence is felt only after it is gone. By the time the rain cleared and the gray morning gave way to a pale afternoon, the booth in the corner had long since been wiped clean. Maria had cleared the cup, folded the napkin, and whispered her thanks, but the weight of the moment still clung to the air. Customers finished their meals in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, and one by one they drifted out into the damp streets. Yet none of them left the diner unchanged. What they had witnessed could not be left behind with the plates and crumbs. It followed them out the door, into their cars, into their homes. The farmers at the counter were the first to carry it. By the time they reached their field that afternoon, the story had already reshaped itself into words they could not keep inside. They told it to their wives over supper, to the neighbors who stopped by the barn, voices hushed but reverent. They spoke of the man mocked as a drifter who stood taller than any of the bikers, who carried silence as if it were armor, who had asked for nothing but respect. The metal, the names he had spoken, the way he had faced cruelty without a single shout, all of it became part of their telling. The teenagers, restless with a need to share, carried the story into hallways and onto phones. By evening, their friends had heard it, then their friends' parents. They described the rain on the windows, the chipped mug, the bikers reduced to shame. Their words carried awe, the kind of awe reserved for legends who existed outside of textbooks and grainy photographs. For them, it was proof that heroes could sit unnoticed in a corner booth, wearing jackets frayed at the seams, carrying histories no one dared to imagine. The older woman with her tea told it differently. When she sat down with her family at supper, she folded her napkin in her lap and said, quietly, "I saw him today, a man who carried more than anyone should." She described his voice, gravelly but steady, the way he spoke the names of the dead as though he were holding them in his hands. Her children listened, silent, and for once no one interrupted with casual chatter. The story became a kind of scripture at her table, a reminder whispered in the soft tones of someone who knew reverence. Even the bikers, subdued and silent on their long ride out of town, carried the story with them. They would never retell it with the bravado they once wore, but each man knew it lived inside them now, reshaping the memory of their cruelty into something they would never fully escape. The leader, who had mocked the loudest, replayed the moment of the salute in his mind, the rain dripping from his fingers, and wondered if it had been enough. And Maria, when she closed the diner that night, turned the key in the lock with trembling hands. She knew the story was no longer hers to keep. It belonged to everyone who had been there, everyone who had seen silence turn into something unshakable. Yet as she swept the floor and wiped down the tables, she whispered his name once more to the empty room. Daniel Hayes. She knew it would echo beyond those walls, carried into homes and conversations, retold until it became more than just memory. By nightfall, the story had begun its journey. In kitchens and barns, in whispered phone calls and quiet reflections, it spread, of a homeless man who asked for nothing, who wanted no pity, no money, no recognition, but who carried everything: sacrifice, silence, and the names of the fallen. The tale would live on, not polished or embellished, but raw and unforgettable. And in every retelling, the truth of that morning would remain, unshakable as the man himself, standing tall in a corner booth with nothing but a chipped mug and a silence stronger than noise.